Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Hunter Ohanian, and I'm the director of the Stonewall National Museum and Archives here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And I'm wearing a little bit of fleece. I'm also wearing my new my Pete T-shirt because Pete just became a member of the cabinet, first openly gay man who is a member of the cabinet. But welcome to our virtual series of talks with artists, writers, thinkers, curators, and everybody please welcome Jackson Davidow. Hello, Jackson.
Hi, Hunter.
How are you? Nice to see you.
Likewise, thanks for having me.
Well, we're very happy to have you here, and I have lots to say about all of our work, but where are we finding you this evening? Where are you?
I'm in Boston.
In Boston, yeah, and you were just saying you're in downtown Boston,
Yes.
Which is great, yeah. And what's the weather like there?
Today was, we've gotten past the snowstorm, the blizzard, as you know.
Yeah.
It's still chilly.
Yeah. Well, I was saying earlier, it's chilly here in South Florida. I mean, for us, for me, a New England boy who grew up in Rhode Island, spent most of my life in Boston, and now here in South Florida, I have to say that, you know, chilly now after being here for 2 years, 51 degrees is chilly. And so I feel your pain there, Jackson, because it's hard. For those of you who don't know about Stonewall, we are probably the third largest LGBTQ archive in the United States. We are a community archive, which means that we are independent of any other educational or county or governmental entity. We have the crazy idea that we want to run a private nonprofit library and archive. And it is really sort of a great and wonderful thing, but also very scary at the same time. In the library, we have 28,000 books on LGBTQ history, all organized under the Library of Congress system, fiction, nonfiction, biography, art books. And those are all available for people to come in and take those out. And in the archive, we have 2,700 linear feet of archival material, which translates, I'm told, to about 6 million pieces of paper. It's primarily everything which has been printed about gay culture in the United States from, let's say, like 1950 to 1955 to the present day. We do have things that go back earlier than that, but really our focus is the last 2 quarters of the 20th century to the present day. So serials, archival materials, celebrity stuff, subject matter files. There's just an amazing amount of things that are there. And so if you are here in South Florida, please come by to visit us. We are open during COVID. We started this series during COVID, of course, and it's been great to be able to do it. Probably this might be episode number 33 or 34 now. They're all archived. This is being recorded and you'll be able to find it on our website at stonewall-museum.org. Everybody who's participated in this program is there, and so please take a look. I'd like to do a shout out to my colleague, Emory Grant. And Emory, you are somewhere there. Hello, say hello, Emory.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
And Emory, thank you for being there. He is behind the scenes to make sure that all of this stuff happens well and all the recordings get made as well. So again, the website is stonewall-museum.org. And if you're not on our mailing list, you can just sign up there at the website. I promise you, we won't send you too many fundraising letters, but they will come from time to time. And so it's a way for you to support the community around you. So Jackson, nice to see you. You have to say something to be heard.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, I can. We can.
Yeah, nice to see you as well, Hunter.
Yeah. So Jackson, you and I started working together maybe 10 years ago?
That's when we first met.
Moment?
Yeah, kind of in passing though.
Yeah. Jackson and I worked together. Jackson was working with Jonathan David Katz on a show called Classical Nudes. Was that the show?
Yes.
And what did you do on that show?
Mostly just curatorial research and some other things around the museum too, I think.
Well, of course, it's
before you came on as director.
And it's interesting to hear you say just other things, but of course the thing is that show was looking at art history with a queer eye for 2,000 years, and
Mhm.
it was really an amazing thing. And so Jackson and I got to work. And then this summer, Jackson and I started working together remotely during COVID on different projects at Stonewall. And I have to say that Jackson has been an amazing resource to me professionally with projects that we've done. And in particular, what Jackson has done is he's actually helped us bring a lot of the serials in our archives that are digital to be able to allow you to be able to see those. And so those are all available through our website. And then Jackson also has worked on the LGBTQ timeline, which has been a major part. We now have 10 different versions of the timeline with probably a total of about 1,000 entries that Jackson has researched, which is really just amazing. And then most recently, he wrote a curriculum for us about the timeline, which has been funded by the Florida Humanities Council. So Jackson and I actually meet every week for about an hour, and we move these various projects along. Of course, there are other projects we've been working on as well too, but it's been terrific to work with you in this fashion. And I just want to thank you for all the work that you've done on behalf of this particular archive, but also other queer archives out there in the world.
Well, thank you, Hunter. That's tremendously sweet. And of course, it's been a treat to work closely with you over the past several months and to be in conversation with you tonight.
Yes, indeed. And so it's been good. And it's so Jackson, you grew up in the Boston area. Posted something on Facebook about the fact you're the only one who went to Newton North who made it big by being on this series. So congratulations for that. So after Newton North, where'd you go to school?
I went to university in Montreal, actually. I studied at McGill University, and then I completed a master's also in art history, both degrees at University of Toronto. And then I came back to Boston. So I've been
when you
based
started
here for
when you started your art history studies, what did you think your focus was going to be?
That's a good question. I was asked this recently. One show that was really foundational to my understanding of queer art history was actually at the Carpenter Center for Visual Arts, which is a gallery attached to Harvard University. It was one of the first historicizations of AIDS activist art curated by Helen Molesworth. It was essentially about ACT UP and Grand Fury during the 80s and early 90s, and part of the ACT UP Oral History project that Sarah Schulman and Jim Hubbard spearheaded was shown alongside these works. And I saw that when I was 18 or 19, and it was, yeah, right after I went to college or right before, and I was totally blown away, and I knew that it was something that I wanted to study in greater depth going forward. And of course, 10 years later, I wrote a thesis that explored these histories, albeit from a more transnational perspective.
Yeah, and that's great to hear. I mean, of course, Helen Molesworth was the curator at the ICA in Boston, and then she went to LACMA, and I think she's freelancing now. I'm not sure where she is now, but of course, she's a wonderful thinker with a lot of queer theory now. And so, can you pin a point where you thought that your professional career would move into the queer art history world? Was it that show or was it earlier?
I think, well, the reason I brought up that show was that I hadn't really considered queer art to be a thing before that. I didn't know that histories of queer art existed. I mean, I was 18 or something when I saw it. And I think it just speaks to the rise, both within the academy, but also more broadly across public culture of queer art histories and how visible they've become over the past decade, which is great. And I think that we're working to nuance them and make them, open up new narratives, which I'm excited to be part of. And I know I think it's important to point out your role in the history of queer art. I remember watching one of these talks where Steve Locke, who's an artist based in Boston for so many years, who recently moved to New York, and I know is a close friend of yours, but he was speaking with great fondness about your role in these histories and supporting queer artists and curators and everyone else. And I think that, yes, all of these projects have been remarkable. So you deserve.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you. It's great. I consider myself to be a lucky boy. I get to do a lot of stuff that I want to do. And, but, I because of the work that I've done, I've been so much on the academic side at certain times, then so much on the gay and queer side. And so I always love to see how this mashup happens. When I was at Leslie Lohman, of course, it was the Leslie Lohman Museum of Gay and Lesbian Art. There would just be so much discussion about what are those words, what do they mean? And I would always argue for, let's just call it the Museum of Non-Heteronormative Art and just be done with it, and then there's, artists out there who say, well, why should I identify as a Black artist? Why should I identify as a woman artist? Why should I identify as a gay artist? And then you talk to the art historians who say, well, blah, 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 this is not part of a particular movement. It's not part of a particular genre. And of course, so many of these arguments are really things that are sort of spun around within the curatorial and art world. But what's important is that these conversations that happened in the 15th century or in the 17th century or the 18th century or 19th century, this is actually what formed the canon that is part of what we learn today. And so the question I have for you about this is there in the canon, is there a place for queer art history? Is there a place for queer art or for gay art? Will somebody look at this tape 100 years or 200 years from now and say, oh, baloney? Or will they say, no, these were people talking about something in the same way we were talking about realism or abstraction is a great recent example. Abstraction is something that people in the mid 20th century thought was just phooey, and they would pay no attention to it. I mean, photography was something that people wouldn't pay attention to, even by the 1970s. So are people going to pay attention to queerness in the art history canon at some point in the future?
I think as the past decade plus has illustrated, these histories are receiving a tremendous amount of attention, and they've become mainstream in certain ways, and for that reason merit critical interrogation and nuancing, I believe. I think that there's, as evidenced by institutions such as Leslie Lohman, there does seem to be I wouldn't call it a mainstream institution, but certainly a lot of these artistic practices and artistic histories are becoming more incorporated, not just within more marginal institutions such as Leslie Lohman, but also if you look at public programming and curatorial commitments at more major museums, at least within places in North America and Europe. And it remains to be seen if queer and trans artists are actually being supported in meaningful ways. But as far as what we can keep track of over the past 10, 20 years, there does seem to be a decisive tendency towards, yes, to answer your question. I do think that these are being collected in serious ways and appreciated, hopefully in serious ways too.
Yeah, and of course, times are being these ideas are being challenged all the time. The
Mhm.
fact that we can see a museum of African American culture in the United States, the fact that we can see a museum of Native American culture in the United States. There was just something in the last CARES Act about creating a museum of Latinx culture in the United States. Do you see the possibility of a major queer or LGBTQ museum in the United States? Is that a possibility in your mind?
I mean, I think you brought this up recently in a conversation and we were talking about it. And I drew attention to the fact that your institution, Stonewall National Museum, has national in the title. And I think both Stonewall and national probably as words confuse various audiences because your museum isn't in New York where the Stonewall riots occurred, but B, the fact that, what does national mean? Does it mean that it's a state institution? Does it mean that it's funded by the government? Or that it's based in Washington, D.C., for example? So um, of course, it's not a national institution. Of course, it's in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. But these institutions, as you noted at the very beginning of your talk, it's a community archive, a community museum. And I think that these are sites, even if they're a bit more precarious and funding doesn't come as flowingly to you as it does to other places, the fact that they're still very much in the hands of people, in the hands of community members who are so passionate and engaged. I think that's what's so extraordinary about the Stonewall. And again, it's been a privilege to get to know your collections and your staff and you in these various projects that I've worked on. I think that it remains to be seen as far as, how mainstream and how LGBTQ politics proceed in this historical march and this trajectory. And it seems like it's tending towards that possibility that you floated, though I suppose things can change quite radically in a short period of time, right? As we've seen, even just within the past few years,
Yeah.
trans rights,
You're absolutely right, and things change. And of course, this is not so much about Stonewall. I mean, it's very easy for organizations to put words in their title and to say Stonewall or to say national and that kind of stuff. But as you say that and you think about, who are the successful ones out there, imagine having a Priscilla of the Desert ride at Disney World, or having a Stonewall ride at um, Universal World, or these places. The idea that can you actually create gay themed attractions at things that the public want to go to, and what is that relationship to reality, and what does that actually look like, and is that the way that gay content gets out there from a critical way? It would be very interesting to go to Walt Disney World and get on the Priscilla of the Desert ride. And, we'd all have feather boas, and we'd be on pink buses, and we'd be going through it. And that would be like somebody's idea of what a queer world was like, which of course is just a fictitious version of it. But I think we have to be careful that when we think about museums and those that present attractions, that it doesn't get reduced to that level of conversation.
Yeah, and again, the institution that you direct right now is radically different from Disney World, and I don't think you're trying to compete.
No, but of course we have to worry about where we fit within the bigger popular culture as well too. So we have an exhibition up right now called Queers at Home, and it will be up for about 2 more weeks, and it is drawn from our archives, and it's really looking at how LGBTQ people have described place and how gay culture, and when I use the word gay, of course, I'm talking about the broader sense of the LGBTQ community, but in a large part because of the holdings that we have, a lot of it is based upon holdings which derive from white males. And so there could be a spread from Blue Boy magazine, which talked about nappy gray carpeting and track lighting and muted colors, or other publications, Bear's Life, about two men living in Costa Rica and creating this great place for them to live. And, you know, so the exhibition looks at a variety of ways in which queers live at home. And so what I was very happy about having Jackson talk about tonight is the whole idea of queerness associated with domesticity, architecture, and a place where we reside. And Jackson has got a presentation to make with regard to that. But before we do the presentation, Jackson, just give us a little bit of setup as to how you got to this particular point, and give the audience some sense of the power and what it is you want them to get out of this. And before you start, let me just remind everybody that if you have questions, throw them into the chat box, and we'll get to them in the last 15 minutes. But this will really be an opportunity for the two of us to have a conversation, and primarily for Jackson to make a presentation.
Thanks for that question. I think it's important to say that I'm not an architect, but I did do a PhD that was based in a department of architecture, and I was immersed in people talking about architecture, both practitioners and historians. So it was a bit of an unusual...
Just interrupt because I didn't finish your bio. Your PhD was where?
Oh, I studied at MIT. And what I was beginning to say is that when I first arrived there, I was very interested in learning more about, you know, what types of queer critiques had been articulated in the field of architecture and in the field of architectural history. And essentially, there has been a lot of important conversations that have taken place since the 1990s, but it's a very marginal part of the discipline and the discourse. So one of my interests was trying to unearth some of these conversations and to bring them to life in my own research. And I've thought about queer space from the perspective of art and architectural history from a number of different perspectives. I had the opportunity to teach a course on the subject at Tufts University, and I also worked on a symposium that specifically looked at gender and space policies, pedagogies, and publics. And I'm keenly engaged in the research at these intersections, and I thought it would be a nice topic of conversation to put in dialogue with your show at the Stonewall, as well as many of your own commitments. Even though I am, you know, talking about architecture, I think about architecture through art and through artistic production. Even if artists, visual artists don't position themselves as architects, I think in a lot of ways, artists have very architectural and visionary takes on the world and remaking the world. And so in the presentation that I prepared, you can momentarily we'll see, you know, what are some of these trajectories and ways of thinking about space, architecture, and the built environment in relation to queerness, so non-normative gender and sexuality.
Great. Well, and of course, that's sort of the amazing part, which is the fact we have the natural environment and the man-made environment, or the human-made environment. And now when we think about the human-made environment, how do we put that lens of queerness on it? And so that's sort of a beautiful segue. So why don't you go ahead and share your screen, and let's load up the presentation.
Sure. Here we go. Can you see it?
Yep, you're
Okay.
good.
Can you still see it?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so I think collectively we've introduced the topic at least a little bit, and I want to dive right in to thinking about when people hear the phrase queer architecture, like what do they think of? I think that their minds often dart to a couple of different possibilities. So queer architecture conjures up architecture that variously interfaces with queer bodies and identities. More often than not, these are conversations about what LGBTQ people need and what they're denied frequently. So of course, bathrooms are sites of everyday gender-based violence, policing, harassment, and this is particularly true for trans people who are often unable to use the bathroom that aligns with their gender identities. Transgender activists and critics, so we see Gavin Grimm here, right, in Virginia, have bravely fought back against discrimination that they've faced in bathrooms in various settings. And I think that conversations about anti-trans harassment in bathrooms are often coupled with this notion of safe space, which in my opinion has kind of been emptied of meaning in terms of how it's been embraced institutionally and not always in a very critical way. But when one thinks of queer architecture, one might think of these discourses, right? I'm inspired by Castle's monumental work called Pissed, which they created in 2017 in response to anti-transgender discrimination at the site of bathrooms, right, in which they collected over 200 gallons of urine and created this extraordinary, brilliant work that drew on a range of art historical reference points. We don't need to go into all of them, but from minimalism to Duchamp, for example. I also think that when people hear the term queer architecture, it can point to spaces of queer social and erotic life. So architectural sites where mingling, chatting, cruising, sex, and other activities have occurred and can occur, where new collectivities and communities can emerge. Another way of unpacking the term is thinking about how sites relate to LGBTQ identities, in particular people. So I'm thinking about buildings or spaces that are designed, commissioned, or inhabited by queer people historically or in the present. This is just one example of probably a home that Hunter is quite familiar with, perhaps. You know, and it was the summer home of interior designer Henry Davis Sleeper in Massachusetts. But one could also connect this idea of authorship or identity to function, to architectures that function as museums, memorials, monuments. So here we have pictured the forthcoming Pulse Memorial Museum, which will be in Orlando, probably not too far away from Disney World. But one can ask, like, what's queer about this? Is it queer because of this history that it's marking, or is there something inherently queer or non-normative about the design? This is a conversation that I think happened especially at the New York City AIDS Memorial. A lot of people were disheartened by the design that had arguably very little to do with the history that it commemorates, the ongoing history that it commemorates. I think that all of these interpretations, by the way, Hunter, feel free to interject whenever you have a question. All of these interpretations.
Thank you, Jackson. I'm not shy.
Okay. And also, if there are other questions, of course, too. It can feel hard to be engaged with someone, with audience members on Zoom, but I'm doing my hardest to be present with you. I think all of these interpretations and meetings are totally valid, though I'm hoping to perhaps expand our understandings of architectures of queer world making, self-making, and intervention. And perhaps it would be helpful, just for the sake of the discussion tonight, to define what I mean by architecture in a broad sense, architecture as compared to space, for example. I think about architecture simply as the built environment. And I think about architecture, it's not something that, you know, a lot of people don't really think about the meanings of buildings. They kind of just accept, you know, this is how our lives are structured, how, you know, places exist in the world. But architecture actually has social and political functions, and they affect every realm of our lives. Architecture and design play a crucial role in shaping our identities and experiences. And I'm not just thinking in relation to gender and sexuality, but also vis-a-vis race, class, disability, and so many other things. As I said before, I think about architecture, and other people do too. It's not just about what's built. It's about what's envisioned. So much of architecture and architectural practice is speculative. So it's not everything comes to life. It might just exist on the page or on the screen, but it's still valid in terms of the imagination that is conjured up. And I think that one thing that's quite special and unique about these conversations of queer architecture, because of the speculative nature of so many architectural practices, it can help us think about queer possibility and think about the future in new and meaningful ways. So I am hesitant to attempt to define queer architecture as more just a term to bring all of these different threads together. But I do want to begin to map out tonight some of these areas where queer discourses and experiences come into dialogue with the built environment. And as I said, I'm very passionate about art, and I know Hunter is as well. So a lot of these coming slides are, you know, artistic visions of architecture. They're mostly dating from the 80s to the present, and they're mostly things that I've written about in the past or things that I'm interested in exploring more in the future. And we'll see how the time passes. I don't want to rush us, and I don't know where the special interest lies in terms of the audience, but I think we can consider architectures of a few different zones. I'm thinking nightlife, sex, the domestic, and the museum, and all of these various sites intersect in one way or another, one could argue. I thought that, oops. Oh yeah, and I also wanted to say that I'm interested in thinking about architecture in terms of how queer people have critically engaged with existing architectures too. So a project such as Hong Kong-born artist Sang Kwang Chi's East Meets West, in which he's queerly and playfully engaging with the New York cityscape, interjecting his own body. A very famous photo series, Sunil Gupta's Exiles, which is a remarkable photo series, conceptual photo series that illustrates various sites in Delhi from the mid-80s, capturing men who have sex with men cruising with one another in front of medieval monuments and temples. One can also think about, of course, I mean, going back to our conversation earlier in terms of National Museum, how the Eight Names Project AIDS Memorial quilt was in critical dialogue with the Washington Mall and all of these monuments to American history and politics. On the right, we see the Ashes Action, which was a famous ACT UP protest in which people tremendous and with much power and potency and meaning through the ashes of their loved ones who had died because of the AIDS crisis over the fence of the White House onto the lawn. And so I think this can also be an architectural intervention of sorts. With this slide on the screen, I think it's important to contextualize the development of queer discourses in the field of architecture and architectural history. They're very much entangled in the AIDS crisis and emergent notions of queerness. In the late 80s and 88, 89, this is a really crucial period in time, as so many of us know, in terms of the development of new activist programs such as ACT UP, like what we see on the right, or I mean, even this quilt, which had a much more liberal memorializing function. People started to think about queerness in new ways. And this cut across the academy and the streets, right? In a really unprecedented way, I would say, building on feminism and other salient bodies of criticism in the academy, but there was this cross-pollination that was happening and really shaking things up, and a tremendously rich social movement emerged, which was AIDS activism. And this influenced a lot of people, a lot of architects and historians who are trying to expand on the intellectual topography of feminist interventions in the field of architecture. So they wanted to foreground the ways in which space is not just gendered, but also sexualized. And queer theory is this, sometimes menacing intellectual development, but it called into question this binary, right, of categorizations of identity. So figures such as Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, Judith Butler, people were trying to think about identity in new ways beyond binary models. And this wave of queer spatial theory is what I'm calling it. These are some early contributions. This wave of thinking underlined difference as a way of, conceiving space and challenging heteronormativity and patriarchy. On the top, we have some classic texts, and then on the bottom, some more interdisciplinary ones that came a little bit later. A lot of people writing about queer space and theorizing it in creative and innovative ways. We're coming from different fields, it's important to point out, like literary studies and critical theory. Are there I'm not paying attention to the question box, so let me know if.
Oh, you're absolutely fine. There are a few
Okay.
comments there and quick questions, but I think you should keep on rolling on.
Okay.
And then we'll get to some of these in a moment.
Okay. All this to say, it's hard to categorize. Let's see. Oh, and I wanted to just kind of point out a couple of influential exhibitions that were part of this rise of queer theory in both the academy and the architecture world. So this exhibition at the Storefront for Art and Architecture was groundbreaking, called Queer Space in 1994. Notably Eve Sedgwick, who, I mean, we don't generally think about her as an architectural thinker. She was quite deep in literary studies, right? In performance studies, which she helped develop as a field. She was involved in this exhibition, which is interesting. And then she was also involved in house rules at the Wexner Center, which is probably, like, in terms of if I were to create a historical context for your show, Hunter, on domesticity, this would probably be kind of a crucial forerunner. So she was writing about her domestic experience with Michael Moon, her colleague and friend and his partner in Durham, and where Duke is. There were responses to, in terms of what architects were devising and new projects that they were conceptualizing. So Joel Sanders, who was not just a practitioner, but also a theorist who has been avidly involved in debates in queer space since the 1980s, and I think has had a really inspirational run. He was thinking about architectures that challenged the nuclear family and constructs of patriarchy, and introducing new erotic ways of thinking about space through a design practice. And then it's, again, interesting to trace his personal trajectory, because with Susan Stryker, the great trans historian and critic, he's been working on this project called Stalled, which has had a great influence in a number of realms, trying to rethink bathrooms, responding very much to the experiences of transgender people, and wanting to create gender neutral bathrooms that suit people, and not just vis-a-vis gender and sexuality, but also in terms of religion, other types of disability. And this work, importantly, has carried on in terms of his response to COVID-19 too. He's one of the most prolific architectural figures thinking about how buildings should, how architectural practices should respond to this horrid COVID-19 pandemic we're living through.
And of course, I mean, just with this one slide that you have here in the Stall project, when I saw this the first time, I was just blown away by the simplicity of actually the idea of what, not that I had thought about it all that much before, but the idea of what a public restroom is, and the idea that there are three basic elements to it. We go in there to check our hair, we go in there to make sure that our makeup is okay, or we want to wash our hands, or we want to eliminate some kind of bodily fluid or solid. And so it has nothing to do with our race or our gender or our sexual orientation or anything else. It's all about functionality.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what this has brought to us, is to realize that all these other things that are put on these very common institutions in life have no meaning whatsoever, because they have nothing to do with the base purpose of what's going on in these spaces. And these are just very natural human spaces to be in.
Yeah. And I mean, of course, there are a number of reasons why they're not possible to uh, realize, right? Not every institution can afford this type of design, but yes, absolutely. They really can change one's way of thinking about everyday design and what our needs are as individual people, and especially trans people who face so much discrimination in so many ways, particularly with regard to bathrooms.
Yeah, it's remarkable. Okay, let's keep going. Sorry.
Okay, don't worry. Well, I think one thing, and it relates to this, is there's tends to be this very utopian bent to queer architectural thinking, and Jose Munoz's notion of queerness as the futural, as the not yet here, as queerness as collectivity, and filled with wonderful potential. These are ideas that trickle down into architectural discourse, and I think can be found in various ways through projects like this. Though, again, what is interesting to me about Joel Sanders' work, which is heightening eroticism and trying to think about masculinity and new modes of inhabiting that. This is very engaged with gender politics and trans politics in particular. And so there seems to be a shift in emphasis away from this earlier moment of erotics to something that's more embedded in a liberal, human rights discourse of people's.
Well, I think the human rights piece is an important piece because Ira has just raised the point that it's important to think about building codes and zoning and the political institutions that create them. And of course, those institutions, whether you are in Manhattan or Los Angeles or just some small town, there is a building code that is codified in the local law that says what can happen in these kind of spaces. And so to think that the zoning laws and the building code laws are imbued with sexual tension or gender tension or human tension is really kind of an amazing fact that they don't need to be, because ultimately at the end of the day, they're just trying to keep everyone safe, and they're just trying to create some place where you can groom, wash, or evacuate. And it's not more complicated than that.
Yes, thanks for bringing that up, Ira. And I think if it's the same Ira, he is an instrumental queer architectural historian as well. And I'm very grateful that I was able to publish some of the images that he took at the new St. Mark's Baths. Happy you're able to make it. So shall we continue, or shall
Yes,
we?
please do. Let's please continue, and then we'll get to some more of these questions and comments.
Okay.
Folks, keep on putting your questions and comments up there, and then we'll get to these at the end.
Okay. Yeah, what I was planning to do in the remainder of this, having given somewhat of a broad, streamlined overview of just the tip of the iceberg of queer architectural discourse. I also wanted to point you to some developments within the past 10 years that have been very influential to me. Petite Mort it was an exhibition, but then turned into a book project from Carlos Mota, contemporary artist, and Joshua Lubin-Levy. This was a very important book that thought about how technology and gentrification have changed queer social life, with an emphasis on gay men. Then Log released an issue that was devoted to the topic of queer space a couple of years ago. Transgender Architectonics by Lucas Crawford is a pivotal text, a very brilliant book. Lucas is coming from the vantage point of literary theory from English, but writes about architecture. And Unplanned Visitors is a must-read by Olivier Valeron, which was just published earlier this year, I believe, and is, as far as I know, the first academic queer architectural history book, which is notable.
Yeah.
And he delves into a lot of these questions of queerness in the domestic in great depth, with an emphasis on exhibitions too, and curatorial approaches. I think that based on the amount of time we have left, Hunter, it might be best not to go through the series of images quite rapidly, and perhaps to respond to some of the questions and comments, unless you have another.
No, I think that's great.
Okay.
So let me read it. Let me read a note here from Justin, who says, I have professional experience in Native contemporary arts and Native architecture. Today's curators talk about Native contemporary art, which Native people define pretty consistently as any art created by a Native person. Same for Native architecture, but there is an expectation that the architecture be rooted in Native images and Native values. Native people don't want to be boxed into something narrower. Is there a parallel here with gay art and architecture or Black art and architecture?
Thanks for pointing that out. And I would definitely agree with what you just said. And I think Hunter probably has insights into this question as well. And it's something that Hunter and I have discussed quite a lot, actually, in the course of our work together, this difference between queer as something that is a historical term that was embraced in the mid-late 80s with new meaning that was political and personal and very complicated, but revolutionary in its particular moment, and something connected to a theoretical commitment too. So a lot of things happening at once. But there's also this acronym LGBTQ, which again points to more specific identities within a kind of essentialist framework, which is necessary for getting politics done and for, how people make sense of their lives and make sense of each other's lives. So I think it's a little bit different in terms of, from what I understand, reading about Indigenous issues and labels of Native art, but there are definite parallels and similarities. And I think that a lot of queer artists, as a lot of, it's even more for artists of color, I would say, but a lot of queer artists sometimes feel that they must make work that is solely about queer issues, when in reality, there's a spectrum of things that one can make work about outside of one's specific identity position. I think this is something trans artists feel especially, and a lot of artists of color have the same criticism too of these labels, and how specifically white people in power tend to frame their work and their identities.
I think that's well said. And I think, Justin, the other thing I would say about too, when I think about the importance of Native architecture, Native places having to impact Indigenous communities in North America and South America, and comparing that to what we're talking about with queer architecture, I think back, and certainly I'm not an expert on this subject, but I think back about maybe 2,000 or 3,000 years of culture in North and South America, which actually helped form those beliefs and the culture of what Native places were about. The queer and the gay community, even though we can certainly identify same-sex behavior for 2,000 or 3,000 years, as a community, it's not something that's been around for more than a drop in the historical bucket. And so when you compare it to other things or other groups out there, we don't know. I don't know the answer to that yet. And I think what's interesting is as we develop queer culture and understand that queer culture is not just about same-sex acceptance. It's really a cultural difference about those of us who live and desire and write about and think about and swim in the waters of non-heteronormative behavior. That we're kind of in the nascent stages there. There have been fits and starts over the years, but we're just really beginning to find our legs now, only because we've been faced, as we all know, with so much repression for so many years and having to sort of push this down and to be somebody else, that we're just beginning to see this stuff sort of coming up. And so check back with us in 300 or 500 or 1,000 years, and we can actually begin to answer some of these questions, I think, in a really kind of amazing way. And that's why it's kind of fun to look at some of this stuff very early on. We have a question from Charles who says, I look forward to knowing more of Jackson's writings. And so, Jackson, can people find your writings? Uh, can people find your writings on your website?
Thanks, Charles. And yes, I have a website, which I believe has been shared in the chat, and my writings are available there.
Okay. And Jackson, I just got a note from Emory saying, can you unshare your screen so it's now just us? So we're doing that.
I almost left the meeting.
Nope, don't do that. You're still here for a few more minutes. And so the rest of the question is, I look forward to knowing more about Jackson's writings, affordability of creating spaces and accessibility to those spaces, often defined as LGBTQ queer spaces over time. I think of early gay centers and where they were located in the spaces they occupied. I think of the early clubs of New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, et cetera, and how they created space for tribes of mostly gay men. I think of trans and BIPOC folks now and how they connect in places, moving from homes and apartments and community and social spaces. So Charles, that's absolutely right. And I feel a lot of the same way, in the sense that for me growing up, queer spaces or gay spaces were all about sex. It was all about simply about being adjacent to people, about having sex. And that's not what we're talking about here, but that's what our experience was. So queer spaces were a gay bar or the baths or some outside cruising place. Those were or maybe it might be Neiman Marcus or Bonwit Tellers, or, it was just a place, or maybe the restrooms at the Boston Public Library. I mean, it would be these places in which you would see other like-minded individuals there. But it seems to me as if the unifying factor, the common denominator, was actually looking for intimate relationship with other queer people. And what's nice about this is that sex is not necessarily the currency that we're bringing queer people together about. There's nothing wrong with bringing people together about sex. I'm not being prudish about it. I'm just saying it's not the only way in which to bring people together. Jackson?
Oh, I would echo what you just delineated. I think that was a good response. And again, there have been a plethora of different queer spaces that might be imbued with some sort of erotic or sexual something, but at the same time, queer people have developed strategies and tactics that enabled them to build communities and to connect with one another outside of solely sexual frameworks, right? So just like your museum and archive, I feel like that's such a beautiful example of
well, yes, yes, thank you. And again, of course, institutional gay and queer spaces are definitely a safe place for people to go. Mm-hmm. But it is kind of funny that you have to have, these small little institutions or LGBTQ centers around the United States or else you have the Whitney doing one show about David Wojnarowicz, or some other gay theme going on out there, or maybe museums feel more like a gay or queer space simply because people are looking at something aesthetic. Maybe the symphony is a place where people feel safe. Maybe the symphony becomes a gay space, and maybe even theater becomes a gay space in which people feel. But you know, does does a baseball field or a football field or one of those, do they feel as equally safe? Maybe on gay day or some other way in which they try to appease a certain group that they do. But by and large, I don't think that a football stadium in Chicago or Indianapolis feels as safe of a queer space as a museum does or theater does. And also to say too, that safety does have a lot to do with it. And again, the queerness of it is the fact that we can actually turn what the expectation is on its head. And the fact that you can be somebody who's expected to be there, can be there and have an enjoyable time.
Yeah, I thank you for sharing that. Right.
Well, we've run out of time here. And so I see from Wendell here, me too, thinking of the buildings or spaces that had dark doors or no windows or at the end of alleys. And the architectural design was more or so in the inside of many of our spaces. The famous gay discos seem to be more architecturally unique inside than outside. And yes, Wendell, you're absolutely right. It was really about putting blinders down because they couldn't open it up to the rest of the world. It all had to be behind that wall. And in many ways, that's still the same here today. Another question: have you looked into mostly gay men and their activist role in historic preservation as a block of queer architecture, which I find to be an interesting question as well too. And of course, we do know from history that there have been many gay men, both out and closeted, and also assimilated, that have been involved in architecture, and they have made, or perhaps blocked the path for openness for many of us as well too. And I don't want to cast any aspersions on anybody in that field, but I think that yes, if the conceit of that question is the fact that some members of the gay community have contributed to the problem, I would say amen. I totally agree with that. We talked about building codes and about institutions, and so all of these other questions, Will Jackson's bibliographies and presentation of texts and books, will that be posted? Yes, hopefully that will show up here. And of course, we have a few more things. Oh, and one note here about Philip Johnson, closeted for many years, then builds his totally visible glass house. Of course, that is one of the most wonderful pieces about architecture and really about humanity. About here's a man who amassed a fortune and fame and everything else, and then on the outside, and then builds a glass house as well too, and sort of telling us what was going on and what he thinks should be seen is really just an amazing thing as well. Okay, last quick question, again from Justin. If you were to design a national LGBTQ museum, what would it look like physically on the outside, on the inside? What images should it incorporate? Jackson, I'm going to let you answer that question as our final going away with here.
That's so tricky. I don't know. I have been thinking about monuments and museums, and one institution that's itinerant or mobile or not really based in a real place is the Museum of Transgender History and Art, MAFA, which had an exhibition at the New Museum a couple of years ago. It's run by Chrissy Vargas. And this exhibition at the New Museum was trying to imagine what a a monument would look like to commemorate trans participation at Stonewall. And I think it's an interesting architectural exercise just to think about these speculative places, and particularly with regard to this erasure of trans people across queer history. But that didn't answer your question, I'm sorry.
Well, I think though it's a fair response, and I think Justin, all I can say is thank God I'm not on the charrette to make that decision, because it would be really tough. And you know, they did a beautiful job with the Museum of African American History or the Native American Museum. It's really hard to imagine what a building would look like that could incorporate such a vast um, eh, so it would have to incorporate two things. It would have to incorporate all of the stigmas and the cliches and everything else that people have in their minds about all this stuff, but then also it would have to incorporate truth at the same time. And man, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I just figured it out. That the entire outside would have to be sort of transparent and ever changing, because in many ways, that's what it would be, a skin outside of the building that would be constantly changing and talking about how the communities change and the perception of that community has actually changed. So there you go, Justin. The superstructure outside would be a little expensive, and there would be lots of images that would change outside it. But I think you and I can talk offline about that. But anyway, thank you, everybody. It was great to have you here. I've gone over by 6 minutes, and so I've broken my own rule here. Emory, are you there? Just let's say goodbye to Emory here and make sure. Yes, thank you. Thank you for that. And I want to thank all of you for being here. And this has been a great conversation. Jackson, thank you very much for being here. It's been great to have you.
Thank you, Hunter.
Yeah.
Great seeing you as always.
It's great to see you. And so for those of you, if you're not on our mailing list, to see more of these conversations and everything that we do, it's stonewall-museum.org. We have one exhibition up right now, which is called Queers at Home. We're opening an exhibition next week called Off Our Backs, which is a look at early lesbian publications, curated by Megan Kent. And so I'm very much looking forward to that. So that won't open this Friday, it'll open the following Friday. And then 2 weeks from that, we'll be talking about another queer space, which is the Saint. And the Saint was what sort of the most desirable and envied disco in the 20th century. It was located on 2nd Avenue and 6th Street. It was owned and operated by the operators of the St. Mark's Baths. And it was really an attempt to actually bring gay men together at that sort of enlightened moment that they had in the latter part of the 70s, and to create this amazing space that everybody from Betty Buckley to Grace Jones to Eartha Kitt performed. And it was just sort of astonishing. But while all of this great stuff was going on, there was this amazing undercurrent that was happening, that people were actually getting sick and nobody knew what was going on at the particular time. And so it was tending to contribute to that particular problem with the AIDS crisis in the early 1980s. So anyway, at Stonewall, we have an amazing collection of early posters from the Saint, and those and other ephemera will be in the exhibition. It's been fun. I've just about finished writing all the wall text for it, and it's been fun to be doing the research and work on that. So that show about the Saint will be opening second or third week in February. We're in the design phase of that right now, and so looking forward to doing that. And so thank you all. We'll see you all next week, and everybody stay safe. And I only have one bit of personal pride I want to say. I'm getting my COVID vaccine next Tuesday. So here's to number one, and I'm very happy that's happening. So Jackson, thank you. And we will see everybody soon. Thank you. Good night.
Thanks, Hunter. Good night.